Lyra had always known that change would come to her world eventually. The ancient prophecies spoken by the crystal seers had warned that a day would arrive when the sky would bring strangers to their lands. She had listened to those warnings many times during her long life spanning 500 years, yet nothing had truly prepared her for the moment when the great human ships descended from the clouds and settled in the valley below her mountain home. The elf woman stood on the highest tower of her stone fortress, gazing down at the sprawling, human colony that now occupied what had been pristine wilderness for countless generations. Her eyes, ancient and sharp despite their youthful appearance, took in every detail of their settlement. They had built structures using methods unfamiliar to elf craftsmanship, relying on metal and rigid frameworks rather than the flowing designs that harmonized with nature. Her 2 dragons rested nearby on the warm stone floor. Storm, the larger of the pair, possessed scales the color of midnight water under starlight. His wings spanned nearly 30 feet when fully extended, and his presence alone could make lesser beings tremble with instinctive fear. Fire, Lyra's closest companion since the dragon had been merely an egg, displayed the deep crimson of ancient bloodlines. Both creatures had served as her guardians and friends through centuries of relative peace. Storm lifted his massive head and released a low rumble that vibrated through the stone beneath them. He sensed his mistress's troubled thoughts. The bond between elf and dragon ran deeper than mere companionship. They could feel each other's emotions like ripples across still water. Lyra reached out and stroked the dragon's scaled head, her fingers finding the sensitive ridge along his spine. The problem that occupied her mind was not simple to solve. 3 days ago, human messengers had arrived bearing a formal request from their leadership. They sought permission to expand their colony outward into the fertile plains that stretched eastward from their current settlement. They presented maps showing their proposed boundaries and offered trade goods in exchange. Lyra had appreciated their formality, their attempt to negotiate rather than simply take what they desired. But negotiations meant complications. Other elf councils ruled the territories the humans sought to enter, councils that had grown increasingly hostile toward any human presence whatsoever. The Southlands Council, led by the ancient elf warrior Caney, had already sent messengers demanding that Lyra drive the human colony back to their ships and ensure their permanent departure from this entire region. They argued that humans were inherently destructive, that they could not be trusted, that coexistence was merely a postponement of inevitable warfare. Lyra had ruled her territory through wisdom and strength combined in equal measure. She had never rushed into conflict. But she also recognized that hesitation could be perceived as weakness. Other elf lords watched her choices carefully, waiting to see whether she would align with Caney's aggressive stance or chart a different course. The complexity deepened when she considered the humans themselves. They were a puzzle unlike anything she had encountered before. Most species she knew, whether elf, dwarf, or various magical creatures, displayed predictable patterns in their behavior. Humans seemed different. Some were cruel and driven purely by conquest. Yet others among their colony appeared genuinely interested in peaceful coexistence. This contradiction fascinated and troubled her in equal measure. Fire moved closer to Lyra and pressed her scaled head against the elf woman's shoulder. The dragon had always been more empathetic than Storm, more inclined to sense the emotional weight her companion carried. Lyra appreciated this quality greatly. She had learned long ago that leadership often meant carrying burdens that few others could understand. Below the tower, the human colony hummed with activity, even in the late afternoon light. Lyra could hear the sounds of construction, of people moving about their daily tasks. She wondered what their individual lives contained. What dreams drove them to accept the hardships of building a settlement in an unfamiliar land? She wondered whether they thought of the creatures who had ruled these mountains for millennia, or whether they saw the territory simply as empty space waiting to be claimed. A younger elf guard appeared at the tower entrance, bowing respectfully before approaching his mistress. He carried news from the trading grounds at the colony's edge. An unusual human had arrived seeking entry to the commercial district. According to reports, this human moved with uncommon grace and spoke multiple languages, including several elf dialects. He claimed to seek trade and information rather than settlement opportunities. Lyra's interest sparked immediately. an uncommon human. She instructed the guard to allow the stranger into the trading grounds and to ensure that word reached her if anything unusual occurred during his interactions with the colony merchants. As the guard departed, Storm opened one enormous eye and gazed at his mistress with an expression that suggested knowing amusement. The dragon had long ago learned to recognize when Lyra's curiosity overcame her caution. This trait had led to many memorable adventures throughout their shared history. The day grew darker as evening approached. The twin moons of the planet began their rise above the eastern horizon. Lyra remained on her tower, but her thoughts had shifted away from the political complications surrounding the human presence. Instead, she found herself wondering about this unusual stranger in the trading grounds below. Who was this human that spoke elf languages and carried himself with such apparent composure? Why would someone of his evident education and manners journey to a foreign colony seeking trade? The questions multiplied in her mind like ripples spreading across a pond. She had ruled long enough to recognize that moments of apparent coincidence often carried deeper significance. The arrival of the human colony had been expected according to prophecy. The arrival of this unusual human on the same day she received reports of hostile demands from other councils felt like more than simple chance. Storm rose to his full height and stretched his enormous wings. The dragon walked to the tower's edge and gazed down at the colony below. Fire joined him, and the two creatures made a striking silhouette against the darkening sky. Lyra understood what they were communicating to her. They sensed something significant approaching. Whatever change was coming to her world, it would arrive soon. The elf woman made her decision then. She would descend to the trading grounds tomorrow and observe this unusual human for herself. She would evaluate whether he represented threat or opportunity, and she would attempt to gather information about what the human leadership truly wanted from her territory and her people. This task would require careful navigation. She could not afford to show too much interest without appearing weak to the other councils, yet she could not ignore a potential opportunity for better understanding simply to maintain an appearance of strength. As she turned away from the tower's edge, Lyra felt the weight of her centuries of existence settling on her shoulders. Leadership had never been easy, even during times of relative peace, but she had survived and thrived through 500 years by remaining adaptable and thoughtful. She would apply the same approach to the complications that now descended upon her mountain home. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow she would meet the unusual human and attempt to understand what his presence truly meant for her world. Until then, she would rest and prepare herself mentally for whatever challenges lay ahead. Fire settled against her legs as she walked toward her sleeping chamber. Storm followed close behind. The three of them had faced many difficulties together throughout their long association. Whatever came next, they would face it as they always had, as a unified force bound by loyalty and shared purpose. The future remained uncertain, hanging in the balance like a sword suspended above still water. But Lyra had learned through her centuries that uncertainty often contained possibility. And possibility, if approached correctly, could transform entire worlds. She descended the tower stairs with her dragons at her side, ready to greet whatever dawn would bring. The trading grounds occupied a neutral space between Lyra's mountain territories and the human colony below. Merchants from both species gathered there on designated days, exchanging goods and information under carefully enforced rules of civility. Guards from both sides maintained order, though conflict in these spaces remained rare because both communities understood that peaceful trade served mutual benefit. Lyra arrived shortly after sunrise, descending from her tower with Storm and Fire flanking her on either side. Her presence at the trading grounds was unusual enough to immediately draw attention from merchants and traders present. An elf of her stature did not typically conduct personal business in such public spaces. Whispers rippled through the gathered crowds as she walked forward with purposeful grace. The human called Marcus stood among a group of spice merchants examining samples of dried herbs. He was a striking figure precisely because nothing about him seemed striking. His clothes, while clean, showed obvious signs of wear and repair. His build suggested someone who had endured hardship rather than luxury. Yet his bearing contradicted every visual indicator of his apparent poverty. He moved among the merchants with easy confidence, conversing in fluent elf trade language about the properties of various spices and their applications in healing and cuisine. Lyra observed him from a distance before approaching. This was how she had maintained her position of power for 5 centuries. By observing carefully before committing herself to direct action, by understanding the dynamics of a situation before inserting her own influence into it. Marcus appeared to sense her attention before she moved. He glanced up from his examination of the spice samples, and his eyes met hers across the crowded marketplace. What happened in that moment defied easy explanation. His expression showed recognition of her status and power, yet it contained no fear. Instead, she perceived something that felt like understanding, as though he had expected to encounter her at precisely this moment. The human set down the herbs he had been examining and made his way toward her through the crowd. The other merchants quickly cleared a path, recognizing that significant interaction was about to occur. Storm released a low warning growl, automatically protective of his mistress, but Lyra placed a hand on the dragon's neck, signaling that she perceived no immediate threat. Marcus stopped before her at a respectful distance, bowed slightly from the waist, and greeted her in formal elf language. He identified himself as Marcus of the human colony, and he expressed his honor at encountering the legendary dragon lady who ruled these northern mountains. His words contained no flattery, merely straightforward acknowledgement of fact. Lyra responded by asking what business brought such an unusual human to the trading grounds. She noted his command of multiple languages and his apparent familiarity with elf customs. Few humans possessed such knowledge unless they had spent considerable time studying elf culture. Marcus explained that he had traveled extensively across many lands before arriving at this colony. He had lived among various peoples, learning their ways and their languages because he believed that understanding came through direct exposure rather than assumption. He had come to the trading grounds today seeking information about the local spice trade and hoping to establish connections that might lead to future peaceful commerce. The answer was honest and straightforward. Lyra found herself appreciating the directness of his communication. She invited Marcus to walk with her through the marketplace, telling him that she was interested in learning more about his perspective on the human colony's presence in these territories. As they walked, Marcus spoke openly about the division within the human community. He explained that not all humans shared the expansionist ambitions of the colony leadership. Some, like himself, had chosen to separate from more aggressive communities specifically because they opposed constant warfare and territorial conquest. He had hoped to find a place where coexistence was possible, where humans and other intelligent species could share resources without constant conflict. Fire walked beside Marcus, occasionally sniffing the air around him with obvious curiosity. The dragon seemed to sense something trustworthy in this human's presence. Lyra had learned through centuries of living alongside Fire that the dragon's instincts about people rarely proved incorrect. She asked Marcus a question that few humans could answer truthfully. She asked whether he believed his people possessed the capacity to respect boundaries set by other species, or whether human nature inherently drove them toward expansion and domination. Marcus took his time answering. They had reached the edge of the marketplace, where the stone of the trading ground gave way to natural earth and scattered vegetation. He stopped walking and turned to face her directly. He said that humans were not fundamentally different from any other species. Most humans possessed capacity for both compassion and cruelty. The difference between peaceful humans and aggressive humans usually came down to individual choice and circumstance. He had seen wealthy humans willing to share their abundance, and he had seen poor humans driven to theft by necessity. He had observed humans capable of profound friendship, and others driven by hatred so intense it consumed their entire existence. The key difference, Marcus suggested, lay in the choices that communities made collectively. If human leadership chose expansion through military force, then soldiers would follow. But if human leadership chose cooperation and resource sharing, then the people would adapt to that reality. Change required someone willing to advocate for a different path, someone willing to be rejected by their own people if necessary to maintain their principles. Lyra found herself deeply engaged with this perspective. She realized that she had been making assumptions about human capacity for ethics based on the behavior of the most aggressive among them. She had allowed the hostile voices within her own councils to shape her perception of all humans rather than evaluating evidence directly. She asked Marcus whether he believed the human colony leadership would accept limitations on their expansion if such limitations were proposed as part of a formal agreement. He responded honestly that he did not know. The leadership had not consulted him about their expansion intentions. He had only learned of their plans through conversations with other colonists. But he suggested that if Lyra approached the human leaders with a proposal for bounded expansion in exchange for access to trade resources and mutual protection agreements, it was worth attempting. Storm had been walking silently behind them throughout this exchange. Now the dragon suddenly released a sharp, commanding sound that echoed across the trading grounds. Other traders and merchants froze in place, recognizing the warning signal. Lyra understood what Storm was alerting her to. Dangerous people approached from the direction of the colony. A group of human soldiers appeared, perhaps 20 of them, moving with obvious military precision. Their leader, a scarred human woman with harsh features, approached the small group with obvious aggression. She demanded to know why the dragon lady was conversing with one of their colony's rejects. She declared that Marcus had been exiled from the colony for seditious behavior and was no longer welcome within their territory. Lyra straightened to her full height, and her eyes flashed with ancient power. She informed the soldier woman that she was conducting investigation into the human colony's intentions and required full cooperation from all colony members. She further declared that Marcus remained under her personal protection and that any attempt to harm him would be considered an act of aggression against her directly. The soldier woman hesitated, clearly conflicted between her orders and the obvious power standing before her. After a tense moment, she signaled her troops to withdraw. As they departed, she cast hostile glances toward Marcus repeatedly. Marcus began to apologize for bringing conflict to the trading grounds, but Lyra interrupted him. She invited him to her mountain home to continue their conversation in a more private setting. She believed that understanding the human perspective required more extensive dialogue than brief marketplace encounters could provide. Fire nuzzled Marcus gently as they turned to depart the trading grounds. The dragon had clearly formed favorable judgment about this unusual human. Storm, though more cautious, had accepted Lyra's decision without protest. Together, the four of them began the journey upward toward the mountain fortress where so much would soon change. As they climbed higher with each step, Lyra felt the weight of her decision settling into her consciousness. By offering protection to Marcus, she had positioned herself against the colony's military leadership. She had also signaled to the other elf councils that she was willing to maintain a moderate stance rather than join Kaney's aggressive position. The path ahead would not be easy, but Lyra had lived 500 years by trusting her instincts. And her instincts told her that Marcus represented something important. A possibility, a chance to prove that understanding could triumph over assumptions. The mountains welcomed them as they climbed toward home. The fortress doors were carved from wood older than most kingdoms. They stood nearly 20 feet high and bore the intricate symbols of Lyra's ancestral line, marking her lineage back through centuries of elf nobility and dragon bonding. As Marcus stepped through those doors for the first time, he experienced a sensation of profound transition. He was no longer a temporary resident of the colony, or a rejected exile wandering between communities. He was entering the personal domain of one of the most powerful beings in this entire region. Lyra led him through corridors illuminated by crystals that somehow captured and magnified the natural light of the twin moons. The stone walls displayed the kind of careful craftsmanship that could only result from centuries of patient work. Carvings told stories of ancient battles, great friendships, and significant events from elf history. Marcus recognized some accounts from the history lessons he had received during his years living among various peoples. This fortress had been the site of legendary conflicts and equally legendary peace agreements. They ascended a grand staircase to the upper levels where Lyra's personal chambers waited. Storm and Fire settled themselves on opposite sides of the entrance chamber, positions that seemed strategically chosen to observe anyone entering or leaving. The dragons had clearly adapted to their roles as both companions and guardians. They communicated with each other through subtle gestures and occasional rumbling sounds that humans would never hear. Inside her private study, Lyra offered Marcus food and drink. Simple provisions, but clearly maintained with great care. Bread made from unfamiliar grains, cheese that possessed a slightly sweet flavor, and water drawn from a mountain spring that tasted cleaner than anything Marcus had ever consumed. She settled herself into a carved stone chair while Marcus accepted a more modest seat nearby. The elf woman began by asking him direct questions about his past. Where had he been born? What events had driven him to seek a life among different peoples rather than remaining with his own kind? How had he acquired fluency in so many languages? Why did he consistently choose peace and understanding over the more profitable paths of military service or territorial expansion? Marcus answered each question with careful honesty. He had been born in a human kingdom far to the south, the youngest child of a merchant family with modest wealth and significant influence. His parents had been disappointed by his refusal to join the family business or pursue military advancement. At age 17, he had left home to travel and learn, driven by a conviction that different peoples could live together if they made genuine effort to understand each other. He had spent time with dwarf miners learning their engineering techniques and their philosophy of harmony with stone and earth. He had lived among forest peoples who had taught him languages and tracking skills that proved invaluable in his later travels. He had spent years in human kingdoms studying diplomacy and governance. Each experience had reinforced his belief that conflict often resulted from misunderstanding, rather than inherent incompatibility between species. When he had heard about the new human colony being established in these mountains, he had hoped to participate in a fresh beginning, a place where humans might build something different from the aggressive expansion patterns that characterized most human settlements. But the colony leadership had quickly revealed that they shared the same territorial ambitions as every other human community. When Marcus had advocated for a different approach, when he had suggested consulting with the existing inhabitants rather than simply claiming land, he had been branded a traitor and exiled. Lyra listened without interrupting, her ancient eyes observing him with intensity that suggested she perceived details most people overlooked. When Marcus finished speaking, she remained silent for a long moment before responding. She explained that she had ruled these territories for 500 years. She had seen countless conflicts between species, had witnessed the consequences of both aggression and passive acceptance. She had learned that the most dangerous mistakes usually resulted from making assumptions about entire groups based on limited experience with individuals. Yet she had been falling into precisely this error regarding the humans. The hostile messaging from other elf councils had shaped her thinking more than careful evaluation of evidence should have permitted. She had allowed the most aggressive human voices to represent all humans in her mind. Marcus's presence was forcing her to confront the limitations of that approach. Lyra then explained the political complexity that surrounded the human colony's situation. The Southlands Council, led by an ancient elf named Caney, had been advocating for military action to remove the humans entirely from the region. The Western Territories Council remained neutral, but was leaning toward the hostile position. Only Lyra's territory currently maintained an open stance toward further human settlement. If she joined the aggressive councils, the human colony would face overwhelming military pressure within weeks. But if she advocated for peaceful coexistence despite the territorial expansion requests, she risked appearing weak to the other councils. They might interpret her moderate stance as inability to defend her own interests or enforce meaningful boundaries. The only viable path forward, Lyra explained, involved demonstrating that humans could be trusted to honor agreements and respect established boundaries. It would require negotiating a treaty that satisfied both the colony's genuine needs and the elf community's requirements for territorial protection and cultural respect. Marcus asked whether Lyra believed the human colony leadership would seriously consider such a treaty. Was it truly possible to propose peaceful coexistence to people who had been trained to value conquest and territorial expansion? Lyra responded by telling a story. Many centuries ago, she had dealt with a dwarf stronghold that had been aggressively mining in territories that elf communities considered sacred. The initial response from other elf councils had been warfare and violent resistance. But instead of escalating the conflict, Lyra had requested direct negotiation with the dwarf leaders. She had spent weeks learning their perspective, understanding their material needs and their cultural values. She had eventually proposed a treaty that allowed controlled mining in specific areas while protecting the sacred spaces from disturbance. That agreement had held for nearly 300 years. The dwarfs had honored their commitments and the elves had maintained their cultural protections. Both communities had prospered through peaceful trade and mutual respect. She saw no reason the same approach could not work with humans. though admittedly humans remained less predictable than dwarfs had proven to be. Over the following days, Marcus remained in the fortress while Lyra made preparations for formal negotiations with the human colony leadership. She sent formal communications requesting that human representatives meet her in neutral territory to discuss a potential agreement. She also contacted the other elf councils, informing them that she was pursuing diplomatic solutions before considering military options. Marcus observed as Lyra prepared for these negotiations. She studied maps showing the colony's expansion plans, marked territories that could be offered as compromise positions, and calculated what resources the humans would require to thrive without aggressive expansion. She was methodical and thorough, approaching the negotiation as a complex problem, requiring careful solution, rather than a conflict requiring military victory. Storm and Fire seemed to sense the importance of what was occurring. They remained alert and attentive, occasionally communicating with Lyra through subtle interactions that Marcus could perceive, but not fully interpret. The bond between elf and dragons clearly transcended simple companionship. It suggested a form of consciousness shared across species boundaries. On the evening before the scheduled negotiations, Lyra took Marcus to the tower where she had first observed the human colony from above. They stood together watching the lights of the settlement below twinkle in the gathering darkness. Lyra told Marcus that his arrival had changed her trajectory, that his willingness to challenge his own people's assumptions about acceptable behavior had reminded her that individuals possessed power to influence far larger forces than themselves. She could not guarantee that the negotiations would succeed. The human leadership might reject all compromise proposals. The other elf councils might decide to pursue military action regardless of her efforts at negotiation. The future remained uncertain and potentially dangerous for everyone involved, but she was willing to make the attempt. Because Marcus had demonstrated that at least some humans possessed capacity for genuine ethical reasoning and commitment to peaceful coexistence. That single example was enough to justify pursuing the harder path rather than accepting the easier course of military aggression. As the twin moons rose above the mountains, neither of them could predict the trials and triumphs that lay ahead, but they both sensed that a significant turning point was approaching. The negotiation site chosen for the first formal meeting occupied neutral ground deliberately selected to prevent any single party from claiming strategic advantage. A broad plateau midway between the elf fortress and the human colony provided sufficient space for representatives from both communities to gather without feeling crowded or threatened. Guards from both sides established a perimeter, though Lyra had explicitly forbidden any weapons beyond those required for basic protection. The human delegation arrived first, led by a woman named Helena, who held the title of governor within the colony structure. She was younger than Lyra had anticipated, perhaps only 40 years old, which meant she had experienced much of her leadership during the expansion into this region. Her bearing suggested military training, though her expression contained intelligence and calculation rather than aggressive hostility. Helena arrived accompanied by an economic advisor, a territorial mapping specialist, and 2 military officers whose primary function appeared to be observation rather than active participation in discussion. She studied Lyra with obvious interest, clearly having heard legends about the Dragon Lady, but perhaps unprepared for encountering the reality in person. Lyra descended from her mountain tower shortly after the human delegation's arrival. She rode Storm, while Fire maintained position at her fortress in case their presence was needed for defense. The gesture of arriving alone except for a single dragon was deliberate, communicating confidence while avoiding excessive military display that might escalate tensions. The meeting commenced beneath a large pavilion erected for the purpose, sheltered from the afternoon heat, while remaining open enough to prevent any sense of enclosed threat. Marcus was not present at the negotiation directly, as Lyra had decided that his presence might distract from the substantive issues requiring discussion. But she held his advice in her mind throughout the proceedings. Helena began by explaining the human colony's needs with surprising directness. The current settlement had reached maximum capacity. The population continued to grow as new families arrived from human lands seeking opportunity in a fresh territory. If the colony could not expand into the eastern plains, the settlement would face overcrowding, limited agricultural capacity, and social instability within a few years. The human delegation had come hoping to establish clear territorial boundaries in exchange for whatever resources the elf communities required, from human trade goods and labor. They did not seek to dominate the region or displace existing inhabitants. They simply desired sufficient space to build a sustainable settlement that could prosper over generations. Lyra listened carefully, noting that Helena presented the human needs in terms that suggested careful consideration of elf concerns. The governor neither demanded nor threatened. She stated facts and requested discussion of mutually beneficial solutions. When Helena finished speaking, Lyra responded by outlining the elf position. The territories the humans sought to occupy held cultural significance to multiple elf councils. Direct settlement in those areas would damage sacred sites and disrupt traditional gathering places, crucial to elf cultural continuity. Additionally, rapid expansion of the human colony threatened the delicate ecological balance that had been maintained for millennia. However, Lyra continued, she had come not to refuse human requests but to explore whether compromise solutions existed. She had prepared a detailed proposal for your consideration. She presented maps showing specific territories where human expansion could occur without disrupting the most sacred elf sites or causing excessive ecological damage. The proposed boundaries provided adequate space for the colony's projected growth over the next 100 years. In exchange, she requested formal recognition of elf territorial rights, access to specific sacred locations by elf religious practitioners, and prohibition on settlement within designated conservation areas, where the ecosystem remained particularly fragile. Helena examined the maps with obvious care, her economic advisor providing commentary on the proposed boundaries and their implications for colony growth patterns. The human delegation did not immediately accept the proposal, but they also did not reject it outright. Over the following hours, detailed negotiations proceeded on specific aspects of the proposed agreement. The territorial boundaries were adjusted slightly to accommodate a water source that the human colony required for irrigation. The elf sacred sites were clarified to prevent future disputes about which locations required absolute human access prohibition. Trade relationships were outlined, establishing which goods would flow between the communities and establishing fair exchange rates. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, a draft agreement began to emerge. It contained compromises on both sides but seemed to address the core concerns of the human colony and the primary requirements of the elf communities. Helena suggested that she required approval from the full colony leadership council before committing to such an extensive agreement. Lyra agreed to this requirement, understanding that negotiation among human leadership would likely prove more complicated than her own decision-making process. She offered to host the human delegation at her fortress while discussions continued. This gesture, extending hospitality to potential enemies, conveyed significant trust and openness to genuine cooperation. Over the following days, the human delegation remained in the elf fortress. Marcus was finally introduced to Helena and her advisors, and his perspective on human colonial behavior patterns proved valuable to the ongoing discussions. Helena revealed that she had heard of Marcus before through human intelligence networks. She admitted that she had initially considered him a dangerous idealist, whose views threatened practical survival needs, but observing him interact with the elves and seeing his genuine commitment to peaceful coexistence, Helena began to understand that perhaps his approach contained more practical wisdom than she had previously acknowledged. She admitted that she had spent her career in military service, trained to view other peoples primarily as potential threats. Living in the elf fortress, observing the sophisticated culture and genuine cooperation between elves and dragons, was beginning to shift her perspective. Storm and Fire had become comfortable with the human visitors. The dragons would allow Helena and some of her advisors to touch their scaled hides and stroke their powerful shoulders. This physical interaction communicated something that words could not fully express. The dragons had determined that these humans were not inherently threatening. Their instincts, honed by millennia of evolution, suggested that peaceful coexistence was genuinely possible. On the third evening of their stay, Helena approached Lyra privately in the fortress's grand hall. She confessed that she had initially come prepared to extract maximum territorial concessions through any negotiation tactics available. But the elf woman's genuine commitment to fairness and her obvious willingness to compromise had awakened something in Helena that years of military training had suppressed. She wanted to believe that humans and elves could build something meaningful together rather than simply establishing temporary truces that would eventually collapse into renewed conflict. She committed to presenting Lyra's proposal to the full colony council with her personal endorsement. She believed that if the proposal was explained correctly, the colony leadership would accept it as reasonable and beneficial to all parties involved. The human delegation departed the next morning, taking with them Lyra's formal written proposal and a gift of supplies that the elf woman had carefully selected to demonstrate good faith. Storm and Fire walked with them to the plateau edge, a gesture that the dragon seemed to perform with obvious intentionality. As the humans descended toward their colony, Marcus stood with Lyra watching their departure. He observed that something significant had shifted during those 3 days of negotiation. Helena's entire perspective on human-elf relations appeared to have transformed. The governor had begun to see the potential for genuine partnership, rather than viewing interaction through the lens of military competition. Lyra agreed with this assessment. She explained that she had learned through centuries that humans, like all intelligent species, possessed capacity for growth and positive transformation when given genuine opportunity to experience different perspectives. Helena had spent her entire career within military structures that emphasized threat perception and territorial competition. Being exposed to elf culture and philosophy had demonstrated to her that alternative approaches were possible. But Lyra also cautioned that the most difficult negotiations still lay ahead. The Human Colony Council might not embrace Helena's transformed perspective. The other elf councils might reject any compromise that appeared to grant humans territory at all. Political pressures from multiple directions could still derail the emerging agreement before it achieved formal status. The path to lasting peace remained uncertain. But with each passing day, with each conversation that proceeded beyond accusation and counter-accusation, the possibility of genuine coexistence seemed less like fantasy and more like attainable reality. The response from the Human Colony Council arrived within a fortnight. The formal message, carried by a human courier on horseback, contained an acceptance of the proposed treaty with minor modifications to specific territorial boundaries. Helena had successfully convinced the colony's leadership that peaceful coexistence served their long-term interests better than military conflict could ever achieve. The modified proposal actually improved upon Lyra's original framework by offering additional trade protections that would benefit both communities. But even as one obstacle was overcome, another emerged with troubling speed. The Southlands Council, led by the ancient elf warrior Caney, released a proclamation declaring that any elf who supported the human treaty was betraying the ancestral values of their people. Caney announced that the Southlands Council would pursue military action to remove the human colony entirely if the other councils refused to support their position. The announcement created serious tension among the regional elf councils. Lyra found herself navigating a complex political landscape where she needed to convince other leaders that peaceful coexistence would ultimately serve elf interests better than warfare. This required not just presenting rational arguments, but demonstrating that the proposed treaty offered genuine protections for elf cultural and territorial interests. She summoned representatives from all significant elf councils to a grand assembly at a neutral location, a ceremonial gathering space that had hosted important elf gatherings for centuries. The location itself carried symbolic weight, suggesting that this negotiation held profound significance for elf civilization as a whole. Caney arrived with his personal guards, a scarred and weathered elf warrior whose appearance alone communicated decades of military service. He was ancient even by elf standards, his expression hardened by countless conflicts and survival situations. He viewed humans with the absolute conviction that they represented existential threat to elf civilization. In Caney's perspective, the only acceptable human presence in elf territories would be as slaves or permanent exiles. The assembly was extensive, with representatives from 6 major elf councils and numerous minor regional authorities. Lyra presented the treaty proposal, explaining the specific compromises it contained and demonstrating how it protected elf interests while allowing human survival and prosperity. She walked the assembled councils through detailed provisions, The conservation areas that humans could not enter preserved the sacred sites and ecological systems most crucial to elf culture. Trade relationships were structured to benefit elf communities significantly, providing access to human agricultural products and manufactured goods at favorable exchange rates. Most importantly, the treaty established formal recognition of elf territorial authority and created legal frameworks for resolving disputes that might arise between humans and elves. Caney listened without interrupting, then delivered his response with absolute clarity. He argued that no agreement with humans could be trusted because human nature inherently led to betrayal and expansion. He claimed that any territorial concession would be viewed by humans as weakness that could be exploited. He insisted that the only viable strategy involved military elimination of the human colony before it grew too powerful to defeat. Lyra responded by recounting the history of elf-dwarf relations. 300 years ago, those relations had been filled with conflict and suspicion similar to the current human situation, yet the formal treaty she had negotiated had created a peace that continued unbroken to the present day. She challenged Caney to explain why the same approach could not work with humans when it had proven successful with dwarfs. Caney's answer revealed the depth of his conviction. He stated that dwarfs were fundamentally different from humans. They possessed honor and cultural stability that humans lacked. Humans were inherently chaotic and driven by base instincts that no treaty could restrain. At this point, Marcus stepped forward from where he had been waiting at the assembly's edge. His presence immediately created tension, as humans were not traditionally allowed to speak during formal elf councils. But Lyra gave permission for him to address the assembly, arguing that his unique perspective deserved hearing. Marcus approached the center of the council space, standing before Caney and all the assembled elf representatives. He spoke calmly but with obvious conviction about human capacity for honor and ethical commitment. He acknowledged that humans demonstrated terrible capacity for violence and cruelty. He admitted that human history contained numerous examples of betrayal and territorial aggression. But he insisted that humans also contained capacity for growth, for empathy, and for commitment to principles that transcended simple survival. He described how his own people had rejected him for advocating peaceful coexistence. He explained that choosing principle over personal benefit was difficult but possible. He told stories from his travels of humans who had sacrificed personal wealth to help others, humans who had maintained peace agreements despite temptation to break them, humans who had pursued justice even when pursuing injustice would have been more profitable. He concluded by asking whether it was truly fair to judge all humans by the behavior of their most aggressive members. When elves themselves contained individuals ranging from Lyra's wisdom and openness to Caney's hostile certainty, the council fell into profound silence following Marcus's words. The assembly seemed to recognize that something genuine had been expressed in that moment, a human speaking before ancient elves about shared capacity for ethical choice, a human refusing to accept that his entire species deserved condemnation based on the actions of some members. Caney rose to his feet, his hand moving toward his weapon. He declared that he would not tolerate further human contamination of Elf Council proceedings. He announced that the Southlands Council would withdraw from this assembly and pursue military action against the human colony, regardless of what other councils decided. But before Caney could depart, Storm stepped forward from where the dragon had been observing the proceedings. The massive dragon positioned himself between Caney and the council chamber exit, his expression communicating clear warning. Fire appeared beside her companion, and the two dragons released coordinated vocalizations that echoed through the stone chamber with physical force. Dragons did not typically intervene in political matters. Their presence was mostly symbolic during council gatherings. But Storm and Fire were clearly communicating through their actions that they did not support Caney's position, that they had evaluated both humans and the proposed treaty, and they endorsed Lyra's choice to pursue peaceful coexistence. This intervention carried profound weight. Dragons possessed ancient wisdom and long institutional memory. Their opinion on matters of consequence held significant cultural authority. Caney hesitated, recognizing that pushing forward against explicit dragon disapproval would destroy his credibility even among his own supporters. After tense moments of confrontation, Caney withdrew from the council chamber, declaring that the Southlands Council would pursue their own path regardless of the assembled representatives' decisions. But his departure did not change the fundamental outcome. The remaining councils voted to support Lyra's proposed treaty with the human colony. Over the following months, the formal agreement was signed and implemented. The human colony received formal recognition of their territorial boundaries and access to specific resources within elf territories. The elves received confirmation of their sacred sites' protection and established mechanisms for resolving disputes. Marcus became the first human ambassador to the elf councils, serving as liaison between the two communities. Trade flourished as the agreement took effect. Human agricultural goods supplemented elf resources, while elf craftsmanship became valued throughout the human settlements. Young humans began studying elf languages and culture, while some elf scholars traveled to human settlements to understand their perspectives and methodologies. Lyra established formal mentorship of Helena, the human governor, helping her understand elf political dynamics and cultural values. Helena proved to be a quick and dedicated student, genuinely committed to bridging the divide between the communities. She demonstrated to her own people that respect for other cultures could coexist with pride in human achievement. A year after the initial treaty signing, Lyra stood on her tower with Storm and Fire watching the merged settlements below, where humans and elves worked together on joint projects. She reflected on how much had changed since Marcus first appeared at the trading grounds. One exceptional human had demonstrated that bridge building was possible. His willingness to challenge human aggression from within his own community had provided just enough momentum to tip the balance toward peaceful coexistence. Marcus approached the tower, having climbed from the settlement below. He found Lyra watching the twin sunsets reflected in the distant lakes. He asked whether she had regrets about the position she had taken, about placing her political reputation on the line to support peace with humans.